Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As something I've cracked several times this morning already, the appropriately wet morning for a water conference to start us with. My name's Trevor Scott. I'm the chair of the WEA Norfolk Federation of Branches, and it is a small group of us from that federation that have put today together with considerable amount of help from our friends, as they say. Welcome you all again on behalf of the WEA to the John Innes Centre, and to introduce briefly our 5 speakers for the day. So Professor Kevin Hiscock, who is going to address us first, and he will chair the rest of the day for us. And then we have there Andy Brown from Anglian Water. I should say, Professor Hiscock, if you didn't bring your timetable that was attached to your booking form with you, that explains everything. But Professor Hiscock is director of the Agritech Water Cluster, and he's also from the School of Environmental Studies. Is that right? Yes, thank you. So, in sciences, environmental sciences. At University of East Anglia, just across the way, up the road. Andy is from Anglian Water. Then I'm doing them in the order that they're speaking. Dr. Ruth Welters is one of Kevin's colleagues, and is again involved with the Agritech Water project at the University of East Anglia. And then Benedict Orchard is from Adnams, and our thanks go to Adnams for supporting this conference, by the way. And then here Richard Pither is from Village Water, which is a registered charity and works in Africa, and he'll be telling you about that. So I think that's quite enough from me. So over to Professor Hiscock.
Right, well, thank you very much. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I think we can look forward to a varied and interesting programme. Looking at the speakers that we do have, I'll be giving an overview of water resources issues globally and locally, and then we can move on to hear something about innovation in the water sector from a water industry perspective. Ruth will then develop the theme around how we manage catchments to reduce pollution pressures, for example. Ben too will talk on the theme of sustainability and how to use water efficiently in the brewing business. And then Richard will take us in a completely different direction and introduce us to water supply schemes and sustainability in developing countries, Africa being his area of expertise. So it's as much about water today as it is about a sustainable future, because water is very obviously precious. We think of it as a renewable resource, but because of the distribution of water locally, globally, there are places where there is a shortage of water, and so we have to manage the water carefully. And of course, East Anglia, being in the drier part of Britain, has indeed restrictions on the total water availability. So in the future, we do need to manage our water more carefully. So water does indeed matter. We need water for our just our very existence. What 3/4 made up of water, our bodies, so we need water to live by. We can't go a day without any access to water. So it's a very important topic, I would say, as we face this coming century, perhaps after climate change as a global societal issue, then water management is perhaps the second most pressing societal issue globally. So we do need to think carefully about how we we manage water. Now, I have a background in hydrogeology, this being groundwater resources, so I like to take the opportunity when I'm meeting a new group to emphasise groundwater as an important part of our global water resources. So you may not have thought much about water beneath our feet, so I hope to reveal something about that valuable resource as I go through this 30-minute introduction. So water matters, yes, and we have to manage water for a sustainable future. So we're looking towards sustainability as the theme that knits these varied presentations together. So we have fairly generous time slots for the presentations, and I know a couple of presenters have got videos to show, so it won't be sort of chalk and talk all day, and there'll be an opportunity to have some variation within these slots, and indeed opportunities to ask questions. I don't know about the other speakers, but I'm always happy to have the odd question whilst I'm speaking, so as to help clarify any particular point. So we won't leave everything to the panel session after tea this afternoon. If you have burning issues or questions that you want to raise during a particular slot, then let's deal with those in an informal way. So I hope that by being a little informal, we'll maximise our chances to learn. I always tell my students, if we're having fun, we learn better. So let's hope we have some fun and soak up the information better. Okay, so why water matters, from the global system to the everyday. So I have an interest in pursuing a few global issues, but of course those issues are also on our very doorstep. A few comments initially then about the historical development of water use, its distribution globally, a few comments about how catchments work, so I can explain something about groundwater, how we overexploit groundwater quite typically to ill effect, and then we'll look at some of these issues around climate change, pollution. I'll introduce that briefly, and then to conclude I'll just finish up with the way forward in respect of the recently published Sustainability Development Goals, the goal number 6, which relates to water. So that will lay the sustainability agenda out on the table by the end of this presentation. So I like to think of groundwater as being there since the start. I mean, well, since prehistoric times. I was just briefly surfing the web this morning and being reminded of the Happisburgh site, where there is some evidence of human occupation 900,000 years ago. And of course, the nice painting that mocks up what perhaps looked like at Happisburgh is right next to a river. So yes, surface water was very important from the word go for supplying our needs. But Jericho represents the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. And the reason it has been continuously inhabited is because of this big spring here that exists below sea level, I notice. There's this large limestone aquifer that's being recharged over the hilltop where Jerusalem is, and then gradually flows through the aquifer and discharges at the spring. And that spring has flowed continuously through all manner of floods and droughts, where other cities have been abandoned. So Arad, that you can see on the left-hand side, that was abandoned several times during ancient history because the spring dried up. But Jericho, because of its particular location and its spring, has survived. So groundwater kind of led to the birth of civilization, is my large claim. But for many centuries, matters were rather more parochial, and these two photographs here might remind you of local landmarks, the water pump on the green at Attleborough, and then this rather nice example of a water pump at Crinkleford. This one actually, I have learned, was not used for water supply. It was used for damping down the dust on the Newmarket Road during hot periods. But the one in Attleborough indeed would be an example of what we had for many decades, centuries. That was our type of water supply, shallow groundwater that was pumped. We don't take our water supplies like that anymore because they're rather vulnerable to surface contamination. And then a couple of photographs here from past field trips that I have run. Springs, again a spring in Gloucestershire here, at Compton Abdale, at Bybury, from the Lincolnshire limestone. So groundwater has been a constant source for our supplies for many centuries and millennia. And of course today our supplies are from these more sophisticated works. So this is just a random photograph of the inside of a waterworks the various blue pipes, the supply going out into the mains network, and the red there, I guess, that's the pumps that are nicely painted bright red. Okay, back to our textbook then, in respect to freshwater resources on the planet. Of course, 97.25% of water on the Earth's surface is saline water in the oceans. So this leaves 2.75% of water in the terrestrial environment. And of that 2.75%, 3/4 is locked up in the ice caps, the Arctic, the Antarctic, the third pole, the Himalayas. So there's a very small slither of fresh water that's available to us. And of that small slither, nearly 99% is in the Earth's crust as groundwater, and a very small amount, 1.45% of all those other fractions is water circulating in rivers, lakes, in the atmosphere, like it is today, and also in the soil zone. So this immediately shows you that groundwater is a very significant freshwater resource. UNESCO publishes a series of assessment reports giving you information on the current use of water globally, and these typical pie charts show that in respect to drinking water worldwide, surface water and groundwater in equal measure provide the global population with water. The energy and industry sector largely use surface water because of the big use of water from rivers in thermal power generation for cooling purposes. And then in agriculture, nearly 3/4 of the demand for irrigation water is from surface supplies, although groundwater, nearly 1/5, also significant. So if you add these three pie charts together, then the overall abstraction of water globally is biased towards surface water, but groundwater makes an important contribution too. So where is all this groundwater? I like to present this map, a large mapping project by the WEA team and the German Geological Survey, together with the International Association of Hydrogeologists. These hatched areas here in red are all the major sedimentary basins in the world. The famous Great Artesian Basin in Australia. It's almost, it's over about a quarter of the whole continent is underlain by this sequence of sandstones mainly. So the outback was developed, the cattle ranching, and indeed the ability to build the railways across the continent and find freshwater supplies to put into the tender of the steam engine came from groundwater supplies. So the outback was opened up because of the existence of groundwater in that major basin. Today we see this huge economic development around Beijing in North China, and that's completely fueled by the need for groundwater to sustain the drinking water and the food production in that economic powerhouse these days. In the past, in the London Basin and in the Paris Basin, the chalk aquifer during the industrial period was heavily exploited to provide water to meet that growth of industry in the 19th and the 20th centuries. And so it goes on. You've got the High Plains aquifer here, the aquifer in Texas, the Central Valley in California, the alluvial deposits in northern Italy. These are all really important water supplies for maintaining not just public supply, but also for supporting irrigation in these major food-producing areas of the world. Okay, well, not all of you will be so aware of groundwater and how it links within the environment, so I thought I would just put up this simple diagram, this block diagram of a catchment. So we have the ground surface here, rainfall collecting on the ground surface. Okay, some direct runoff into streams and rivers, into a major river here at the bottom of the valley slope. But most rainfall will recharge the soil zone and infiltrate down to the water table. So we have a zone between the ground and the water table that's partly air-filled and partly filled with some water sticking onto the soil particles. And of course, below the water table, all that space between the particles is water saturated. And then under gravity, this groundwater will move down, perhaps discharge at a local stream, where the topography intersects the water table, and then further down here where clearly the river is intersecting the water table and capturing the discharge. And then this water will run to the ocean, of course, and then evaporate, and the whole cycle starts again in terms of condensation and rainfall being formed. But it's this water here that makes up our groundwater supplies, and in East Anglia, essentially, that is the major water resource. We look at the Wensum, the Yare, the Bure, we see rivers, but they are more than 3/4 fed by the chalk aquifer. So in my eyes, with my perspective, I see groundwater dominating our water supply scheme. And I think Andy may mention that Anglian water takes about half its water from river water and half of its water from boreholes directly into the chalk aquifer, but more of that later, I expect. This circulation of groundwater takes, well, it can be quite short. So here's a short flow path from recharge to discharge point. That could be a few years of circulation. But the deeper flow path, the longer flow paths, may well be millennia in time to reach a point where they can be discharged back to the surface here, some faulting or some more permeable part of the clay horizon allowing water to come up under pressure back to the surface. And in the case of the Great Artesian Basin in Australia, in the centre of that continental scale of groundwater movement, at depth, at 2-3 kilometres depth, the water is about 1 million years old. So it's very ancient water, because it's sandstone, it's fairly pure and good quality. But the flip side of this very old water is, if it takes decades to move through the system, then it will take decades to replenish that water. So if you were to pollute this water body here, it's going to take a long time to freshen up that supply and recover the resource. So if you pollute or contaminate groundwater, then you're presenting yourself with a serious issue for many years ahead. Whereas if you contaminate a river, it's bad news because you have fish kill, it will flush out that system in a few days. But with groundwater, if you contaminate it, you've seriously jeopardized your supply. And we can look around and we can see examples of where groundwater is supporting ecosystems at the surface. So this is a photograph of Langmere near East Wretham. That lake there has no water flowing into it or out of it. It's not surface controlled. It simply is an expression of the fluctuating chalk water table. So this is a groundwater fed lake, or mere as we call it. They have similar groundwater fed lakes on the Carboniferous limestone in the west of Ireland, on the Burren, if you've been there. They're called turlochs here. You can see the limestone outcrops, and I happened to be there in 2006 and took that photograph of the period of wet weather. The water table had come up and had filled the Carran Depression with groundwater. And these ripples that you see here offshore at Kinvara is where the fresh water is emerging into the coastal zone. So this is an example of submarine groundwater discharge. So runoff from these limestone hills goes underground through karstic cave systems and then reappears at the coast to give this rather interesting ecosystem there, changing salinity. So groundwater feeds our rivers, it feeds our lakes, and also has a role in the coastal zone. Right, well, groundwater is certainly vital for drinking water supplies, and at least 2 billion, if not 2.5 billion people worldwide depend on water. And this photograph here, I'm a bit of an avid follower of Twitter, and there's a guy in South India that tweets photographs quite frequently of wells in South India. So this is one that I've taken off Twitter. Something of a regional centre, it seems, or a local centre for the village people for both collecting water and for doing the weekly wash. So simple dug well with concrete and paving here to finish off the top. So simple things like dug wells provide villages in rural communities with their water as much as it does from borehole sources for ourselves in more developed and urban environments. And this is a photograph to show the importance of groundwater, well, water in general, for irrigation. This is perhaps Bangladesh, a paddy field there in the background. The local farmer here busy playing with the valve on the borehole there on the pump to regulate the flow into the irrigation canal. So a copious supply there from that alluvial aquifer, so groundwater for drinking supplies and for irrigation. But of course, if we over-abstract, which is all too easy to do, I don't know how much knowledge the farmer in the previous photograph has of groundwater. Seems very copious a supply at the moment. But yes, we don't get something for nothing. So here we have the Kona depression, the drawdown of the water table as we pump from the borehole to the supply. And of course, as we lower the water table, we potentially lose that connection then between the water table and, say, a surface river, lake, or springs. So this drawdown, if uncontrolled, can lead to unintended consequences. And I'm sorry to say that, generally speaking, in some areas of the world, groundwater is overexploited dramatically, particularly in those areas where we have a high demand for irrigation. So this map here from Muller et al. Shows where there is major irrigation. Northern India, again over in the East Asia, around northeast China, the high plains, Central Valley of California, the River Po here, and the Iberian Peninsula. Classic areas where we're growing large amounts of food, obviously important for the global population, but at the expense of overexploiting water resources and often, and in particular, groundwater. And this was highlighted very vividly by Tom Gleeson, who's at Vancouver University, in this publication in 2012, where he showed the enormous over-abstraction that's occurring in some parts of the world. So this grey area here is the size of the land area, the extent of the land area that you need to capture enough rainfall to support the present irrigation water demand. And these coloured red, orange areas are the actual geographical limits of those land areas. So this is the whole of the Ganges in northern India. So that's a very large area in itself, but an even larger area, almost imaginably large, is required to keep up with the supply for irrigated agriculture there in northern India. So clearly we're overexploiting water dramatically there. Again in Arabia, western Mexico, the high plains. Total unsustainable abstraction of groundwater for our benefit in terms of growing food, but it's not sustainable into the future. So here we have some large issues to contend with. And here's a particular example of the northwest African aquifer. Here we see from this satellite image, a Landsat image, some of the irrigation, the pivot irrigation schemes to support the growing of dates. And the blue area here is one of the oases, or chots as they're called locally in Algeria. Well, since the 70s, 2,000 boreholes have been sunk to abstract water from the northwestern Saharan aquifer in a region with minimal to no recharge currently. Well, the impact on that is you've taken the water out of the borehole to irrigate the date palms, but you've not left any water to support the springs that keep the oasis in existence. So the spring flows into the oases have decreased from 200 litres per second to about 6 litres per second. So there's a clear environmental impact from the abstraction of water there for the date palms. So I always feel a bit guilty at Christmas when I have this nice box of dates. I think, oh dear, nice box of dates. But in my mind, I'm thinking of that image of the cost of providing those dates to the environment. And this, of course, is the classic example to show of the impact of overexploitation of groundwater. This is in the Central Valley in California, and we can see how the land surface is deflated. It's subsided as a result of water abstraction. So you've got the coastal range here and the Sierra Nevada here, and this Central Valley then on the west coast in California is infilled with material, the weathering products from the weathering of the mountain and the hill ranges. So these silt layers and gravel in between, it's unconsolidated. So if you remove the water, you remove the hydrostatic support for these unconsolidated silts and clays and sands, and so they just compress once dewatered. Similar to the situation out in the fens, where drainage of the fens has led to drainage of the peats and compaction of the peat, and also wastage of the land surface. But this is the biggest example globally of compaction due to the overexploitation of groundwater, again for irrigation purposes. In fact, the volume of land that has been subsided is 19 billion meters cubed, so it's a huge volume reduction in the land surface there. And exactly the same problem in the fens. So I paint a rather bleak picture of the great challenges here to meet the demand for water supply and for irrigation. And of course, on top of this, we've got the climate change pressure. So these existing problems will be exacerbated by the potential decrease in water availability in some of those areas that are key to our food production. So a decrease in water availability, also changes in the distribution in that water resource. So some areas may become drier, some may become wetter. So it won't be an even change, there'll be variation in the climate response. And of course, many of our big megacities are situated in coastal zones, and with rising sea level and also abstraction of fresh water from coastal resources, this is going to exacerbate, for example, saline intrusion, which will have an impact on ecosystem services like wetland environments in coastal areas, and those wetlands provide flood defence too. So you can think through a number of the implications of climate change in respect of lowering water tables, the impact on the environment, and just basically reducing the volume of available water for supply. Undoubtedly, climate change is with us. The rate of temperature increase is really quite dramatic. If you think in terms of geological timescales, we have not witnessed in the geological record such a fast warming of the Earth's atmosphere. So last year, you may have seen in the general press, 2015 was the warmest year ever recorded, 0.75 degrees above the 61 to 1990 average. And it was at least the warmest year since records back to 1850. Of course, here at UEA in our climatic research unit, we do collect data and contribute to this measurement of the changing temperature. So here's the Hadley Centre Crew T4 data, and along with the North American data sets, you can see this inexorable rise in temperature, which marries the rise in the greenhouse gases. So I've been involved in some research where we've tried to translate some of these predictions for these scenarios for the future climate into what it might mean for global groundwater resources. So we've, through the benefit of working with the climate scientists in the climatic research unit in Crewe, we've taken 5 global circulation models that simulate the Earth's climate, and we've run these 5 models with 4 different projections of CO2, carbon dioxide concentration, into the future. So this representative concentration pathway, 4.5, leads us towards 500 parts per million CO2 by the end of this century. At the moment, it's 400 parts per million. So this is sort of a low to medium forcing scenario. 8.5 is a very dramatic, all-out economic development and the worst case. But I'll just focus on the low to medium case concentration pathway. And then we fed the output, the meteorological variables, into a land water model, this leading global water model called LPJ, which is run by the Potsdam Climate Institute. So we took the climate scenarios and we put those through LPJ, which includes both surface runoff and groundwater runoff, to simulate the impact on recharge and groundwater storage. So here are the 4 concentration pathways. Here's 4.5. And what we see in these scenarios, looking towards the end of the century here, is in the lower latitudes, like here in southern Europe, we see arid conditions becoming more dominant. So this is the yellows and orange and red shows the drying in respect of decreasing available recharge. So we talk much about flooding. It's a major issue this last winter. It's particularly been the case up in northern England, and that's one likely effect of climate variability into the future. But when you look at these simulations globally, as we see here, the signal that hits me most, thinking about groundwater as a resource, is how we have a drying signal in some parts of the world where we are growing, irrigated agriculture. So again, southern Europe affected, the western part of the US, parts of southeast Australia that are very dependent on European-style agriculture. So we have regions that are already dry becoming drier, but also regions in mid to northern latitudes that are becoming wetter. So DDWW is the strap line. Drier gets drier, wet gets wetter into the future. And this is just zooming in a bit on the groundwater store impact. So you reduce the recharge, so therefore you reduce the amount of water going into the store. So again, southern Europe is impacted by lower volumes of water available in major aquifers. Again, the River Po catchment, southeast Australia, western Mexico, western US, Texas, all to be expected to see a reduction in the available groundwater resource. Coming down to our own scale, looking at the UK, then the UK Climate Projections Programme presents for the community the data from these simulations, from the global circulation models, and we see that if we take a sort of a central estimate of the possible summer mean temperature by the end of this century, then we can expect warmer conditions, a more healthy viticulture perhaps in the south and the east of England, but warming perhaps of 4 degrees or more. And in respect of rainfall distribution, in the winter we might expect more rainfall in the winter, less rainfall in the summer, but more in the winter. So a concentration of rainfall in the winter months. And interestingly, that rainfall will be on fewer days. We can expect bigger storms with big amounts of rainfall on fewer days. And this gives, of course, the flood risk that we see so dramatically currently. And then even more locally, down to East Anglia, this is simply actual data of rainfall and maximum temperature month by month from 2001 to 2014. This red cross here represents the average condition, the 61 to 1990 average record. So spots that go to the right show months that are warmer than the average, and those that go to the left colder, and then with respect to the rainfall anomaly, drier and wetter. And I think you can see from that scatter of points there that our monthly weather has moved towards a drier, warmer corner of this diagram. So this sort of reflects what we see in those global circulation models, this sort of trend towards a more arid condition, this forcing towards a drier climate. We are in a dry part of Britain, so perhaps we'll be getting even drier into the future. And the Environment Agency, through its water resources planning, has modelled what the implications of these changes in the weather pattern with climate added in, climate change, would show in terms of river flows. So in the winter period, in February, looking at the east of England, some of our eastward flowing rivers, perhaps a 5 to 10% increase in flow in the winter. But the flip side, the drier and the longer summer periods leading to lower flows, perhaps 30% lower flows in our rivers into the future by the end of this. Well, this is the middle of the century with a medium-high emission scenario. Of course, lower river flows not good for our ecosystems, and higher flows not good for the flood risk. So climate change has big implications for our water resource, and the other big implication that I've mentioned previously was the impact of pollution, particularly on groundwater, where if the groundwater becomes contaminated, then you've lost that supply for many years ahead. And of course, there are many different types of activity at the ground surface, and so many potential sources of pollution, be it illegal dumping of waste or landfill sites, agricultural activities, urban industrial activities, septic systems that are perhaps poorly operating in our own backyard. So many different point sources and diffuse sources over the landscape, that's in respect of agriculture there, could potentially get into our water supply. So it's important that we manage our surface activities to reduce this potential pollution pressure. And I think Ruth will develop this theme a little bit more in her talk. Again, back to the irrigation at the global scale, where we've seen major water abstraction to support irrigated agriculture, we also apply heavy rates of fertiliser to support that intensive growing of food. It doesn't take much. On the back of an envelope, you can soon calculate why we have a problem. Take the rainfall in East Anglia, the Midlands, perhaps 200 millimetres per annum, infiltrating the water table, nitrate leaching losses from fertiliser applications to major arable crops, and you can calculate the mass of nitrogen applied, the amount of water volume infiltrating a square metre of ground, and you can work out that potentially 165 milligrams per litre of nitrate will be in that infiltrating water. The drinking water standard is 50 milligrams per litre. So the mere existence of arable agriculture leads to a potential risk of leaching of this pollution into our water supply. So we must work to reduce these concentrations. And this is fairly old data now, I guess it goes as far as 2000, but just shows how in the 1970s, in the 1980s, when there was more of a drive to produce food under European agricultural policy, well, that drive to produce more food with the use of fertilisers did indeed impact. In this case, it's the Lincolnshire limestone. We can see how concentrations of nitrate gradually increase. Okay, there's seasonal variation as the water table fluctuates annually. Here's the drinking water limit, 50 milligrams of nitrate per litre. But after 2000, with the introduction of agricultural schemes to reduce use of fertiliser and to be using fertiliser more carefully, we perhaps see some hope in terms of at least flattening out this trend, if not in time bringing that trend down. So any activity at the land surface potentially impacts our water quality. Very fashionable these days is the catchment-based approach to managing land management to reduce pollution pressures. And this diagram is quite simple in concept, taken from the US EPA handbook, explains the adaptive management approach to managing our catchments to reduce these pressures from pollution. It's a collaborative venture. We see the need to build partnerships. We have components of that partnership here today. Myself as a researcher, a water industry person, an industry person. Ruth here, yes, you're interested in pesticides. So we need to work together as a team, build our partnership, characterise our watersheds or catchments, identify as a community what our goals are for the future in respect of managing the resource, managing land, surface activity, and then beginning to implement a programme of measures like around agri-environment schemes. Implementation, very importantly, we need to measure the success of those schemes. If they're not working, then we have to, as a community, try to improve the plan and go back through the next cycle. So it's an adaptive management approach, which is enshrined within the EU Water Framework Directive that's based on 6-year planning horizons. The so-called river basin management plans work on a 6-year cycle. So we just started the second cycle, actually, 2015 to 2021. And within this current cycle, there will be plans in the region to try and tackle, particularly diffuse pollution in our very arable catchments that we have. And of course, globally, we have now the new Sustainable Development Goals, which for me brings together a number of these strands that I've introduced to you this morning to try and improve and manage our water supplies for both, supply and sanitation more sustainably into the future. So Goal 6 under the Sustainable Development Goals has this list of targets, if you will, to be met by 2030. So access to safe and affordable drinking water, access to adequate and equitable sanitation and hygiene, improving water quality by reducing pollution, better water use efficiency to drive sustainable water use, and to implement, these last two are kind of new within the next 15 years, to recognise that we need to have an integrated approach to water resources management at all levels with all stakeholders, and to think about sharing water across national boundaries. We don't think too much about this in the UK because we are an island country, although I think the Tweed catchment is shared between Scotland and England. But of course on the continent, the Danube is a huge basin. It covers many countries, so we have to work at national levels too in this cooperative approach. And also, it's new in the new set of goals, is to recognise the importance of water in sustaining ecosystems, like Langmere, for example. Thinking about mountains, forests, wetlands, aquifers, rivers, lakes. So it's not just about water supply and sanitation so much, as with the Millennium Development Goals. That's still there, but these other goals around stakeholder engagement and protecting ecosystems. So this is the blueprint for the next 15 years for people like myself, my graduates to work at, to hopefully see a sustainable water future for now and the rest of this century. So with that big challenge, I'll stop at this point. I don't know how long I've been rattling on for. Oh, a reasonable length of time. Just 5 minutes over, sorry about that. But there we are. That's what I'd like to say as an introduction to the day. And I think a few of these themes will be picked up by our other speakers as we go on. So thanks for that. And happy to take any comment or any question at this point, any reaction. Dave here at the back.
Yeah, how does fracking affect?
Fracking, yes. Yeah, well, as a hydrogeologist, I'm interested in that topic because, for me, and my sort of general reading around the subject and the odd video that I might have watched on YouTube, shows that the actual depth of extraction is deep. And there are aquitards, or low permeability units like clays over the shales. And so geologically speaking, there shouldn't be an issue around the drilling fluids and any gases getting into the near surface environment, because we have to drill a borehole, a drilling well, to extract that gas. And it's the engineering that could fail and allow a pathway back to the surface for the drilling fluids and the gases. So I think it's more of an engineering challenge to make sure that our drilling wells are really tight. And also the surface infrastructure, and the number of wells that you need to extract the shale gas, it leads to quite a big environmental impact at ground surface. And I think it's that's more of an issue than any sort of geological problem around connection between the shale gas and in the near surface. It'll need very tight environmental control. The famous red map in Colorado is red on the wall because there's so many of these drilling locations. When you plot them onto a map, it just gives a red splash. I can't see us in our small island with a dense population having a massive network of shale gas wells in some areas that are, appreciated for their landscape beauty. I just don't see it happening somehow. It's an environmental impact assessment, challenge par excellence. But we'll see. It's there. It could be done, but it will need a lot of strict environmental controls. Is my feeling. Yes, sir.
Your researches are only as good as the political will to implement.
Yes, indeed.
What effect does the European Union
Yes.
have? What impact do you have on the decisions they make?
What impact do we have as researchers on those directives, for example? Is that what you're asking? Yeah, well, we do have an impact on that. As a researcher, I'm interested in that catchment-based approach, for example. So I'm working currently with DEFRA on a large-scale project where we're implementing some measures around cultivation practices and monitoring the benefits in terms of reduced leaching of fertilizer. And we can show that those work, particularly cover crops. We've had some success with radish. Planted early after the harvest, the radish gets established and it mops up any residual nitrogen that's within the soil profile. And DEFRA now are adopting that idea. They're listing cover crops as one of the numbers of measures for reducing pollution. And then people at DEFRA then engage with Brussels, their counterparts, and they feed into developing the Common Agricultural Policy. So there's a sort of a chain reaction. We work on the ground, we provide the results and support policy development, and then our UK government then interfaces with the EU government. So there is definitely an impact on what we do on policy nationally within the EU. The EU, of course, sets the Water Framework Directive and the Drinking Water Directive. These are quite important and quite powerful bits of legislation. They do determine the way we operate. For me, as a researcher, I've seen a whole shift. In fact, the Water Framework Directive was a paradigm shift, not just for industry, but also in education. Previous to the 2000 Water Framework Directive. We worked in our own silos as hydrologists and hydrogeologists. I remember at Peterborough, in the Environment Agency office there, they had the hydrologist on one floor and the hydrogeologist on the floor below, and they never spoke to each other. But the Water Framework Directive requires that integrated approach to catchment management. It also requires stakeholder engagement, so that required the Environment Agency to actually talk to people beyond their own regulatory environment. So that legislation was really a step forward in the way we manage catchments for water resources and water quality. So I think that's been a good influence. But the UK was very influential in determining the Framework Directive in the first place. So there is definitely a conduit there, which we would lose, obviously, if we went Brexit. Which I think is underlying your question a bit. We get quite a lot of our research money from the EU, so we're quite keen on the EU. Yes, sir.
Do you think there's any future in desalination on an industrial scale?
I might hand that question to Andy because it's quite energy intensive. But in the drier parts of Britain, you know, it is a solution. In Malta, for example, requires desal to meet its particularly its tourist in the summer months. It's tourist demand for water. But what do you think, Andy?
Could use the power of the sun.
You could. Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. So in the UK, there's one active desalination plant. So that's operated by Thames Water, just outside London. It is hugely energy intensive, so part of the planning conditions around that was that it had to be 100% renewables. So it's actually fed by a biomass generator,
All right.
I think, which means that the cost of operating it as a water treatment plant is way above their normal treatment processes. And the other issue with it is the kind of super concentrated brine that you get at the end of it, and how you dispose of that, which can cause issues. So at the moment, it's in the mix of decision making, but it depends, where you're located and what opportunities you have. So at the moment it's a kind of last option, but it's certainly in the mix for the future. And if you decarbonise the grid, so if we get to a zero emission electricity generation, then that solves part of it, and it's then just dealing with the kind of waste elements of it.
So it's in the mix. Yeah, good. Yes.
What groundwater recharge methods have you seen that are promising and potentially sustainable solutions to groundwater depletion?
Yeah.
Local scale or aquifer scale?
Yeah, that's a good question. Worldwide, there's quite a lot of examples of people putting their wastewater into lagoons or ponds and allowing the wastewater to recharge. But in some urban areas, that can lead to some pollution issues. But yes, there's a concept, the idea of not returning the water to the estuary to go out to sea, but to putting it onto the ground. I mean, there are examples. I remember in Hampshire, visited a site, a sewage works there, and I mean, the secondary treated water is 99.9% fresh, and they were just allowing it to run out onto the ground directly into a chalk aquifer. So recycling the water directly into the water table. So as a principle, it works as long as there's you've got some good quality water to infiltrate. There's also a managed aquifer recharge, aquifer storage and recovery (ASR) schemes. They're fairly popular for water companies as another way of maximising the available groundwater resource. The greatest example we've got in the UK is in North London. There, Thames Water have a number of boreholes along the River Lee Valley, and they, in times of surplus water in the supply, they pump it through these boreholes into the sands that sit above the chalk, and they store that water there, and then in a drought they will pump that water out. So they deliberately manipulate the excess water in the winter, put it underground, store it in the sands above the chalk, and then pump the water out. That works well because of the hydrogeology in part, but we know that these things can work and will be part of the mix, as Andy mentioned. But globally, lots of people will be just putting their wastewater directly into a lagoon, perhaps not even treated, but as a principle it's a good idea.
I remember as a child, I lived at Baldock.
Yes, I
They had what we called a sewage farm.
Right.
Where the field would have had winding furrow.
Yes.
And the effluent went into that and gradually soaked into the ground. That would be in the 1940s.
Yeah. Yes, that's the same principle.
Well, that was closed because I suppose it was not unhygienic or something. It stank, I can tell you.
Yes. Well, I'll just soon hand over to Andy, who will tell us more about the water industry. But between Oxford and Teddington on the Thames, that water is used 7 times. It's extracted, used, treated, and put back into the Thames 7 times. So we're pretty good at actually using, or managing the demand for water in an engineering sense. But yeah, there are some new ideas around aquifer storage and management that could be developed further.
We lived in Great Wakering for a few years, and there was an article in the Times in, this was maybe 15 years ago. By the time we got our water in Southend, it had been through 32 human beings.
Yes.
That's when we stopped drinking water and turned to Adnams beer.
An advertising strategy for you, Ben. Anyway, Andy, let's hear from you now.
Right, okay, thanks ever so much, Kevin, a great introduction, and you've used up some of my time, which is fantastic. So, no, we'll see how we go. I'm Andy Brown, I'm the Head of Sustainability with Anglian Water, but what I'm going to try and do is only use Anglian Water as kind of examples to give you a bit of flavour. What I want to do is take you through and bring you into the future and talk about the kind of challenges, picking up on some of them around growth and climate change that the water industry as a whole has to face, the changing kind of political kind of atmosphere and also changing customer expectations as well. So that's really the kind of journey dotted in with a few Anglian Water examples in there. So I'll try and keep it broad in terms of industry. Just a little bit about me. So I'm Head of Sustainability with Anglian now. I am actually an ecologist originally, so trained at Bath University, worked for the Ministry of Defence and the Civil Service looking at kind of landscape and ecosystem management, biodiversity. That brought me into Anglian Water because we've got quite a large landownings and been involved in reintroducing ospreys back into England at Rutland Water, managing our sites of special scientific interest and all sorts of things, and then moved into a wider range of things, including leading on climate change for the industry, feeding into the National Climate Change Risk Assessment and the National Adaptation Plan, and then working my way into wider, kind of broader sustainability issues, which is what I do now, working with the board to keep them on their toes, keep them aspirational, and then I work in a number of external bodies. So I work quite closely with Kevin and Ruth on some agricultural topics with Agritech East. I work kind of down in London. Actually, I was hosting some round tables at Deutsche Bank on Monday night on the Sustainable Development Goals and what they mean to business. But I still keep my kind of finger in the ecology hat. I'm a trustee of a local wildlife trust as well. So just so that you don't think I'm a dull man in a suit up here, it helps. So really pleased to be here, and happy to take questions. If you've got very specific questions about a kind of an operational Anglian issue, a personal one, talk to me in the break. I'm happy to talk about those, but I'll try and answer anything else. Missing a very important football match to be here today. Not the Norwich one, no. Hemmingford Juniors under-11s. Top of the table clash. I'm also a coach for our local village football team. But looking at the weather, I'm quite happy to be in here today. So water industry is a bit dull, isn't it? Really, a bit dull, a bit staid, a bit boring. We used to refer to it as the silent service, as an industry, we thought it was a good job if no one was talking about us, because it meant, we were giving you water and we were taking things away effectively. That's not the case. And I'm going to be, part of my role as well as sustainability, I have an education team we have a couple of education centres. I employ teachers who go into schools and talk with our future customers about water and about climate change and all these kind of things. So if I stop to ask you to put your hands up every now and then, that's the teacher's influence of me, but it breaks down the barrier between me and you. So to start off, if the technology works, I'd like to take us into the future a little way.
Good morning and welcome to the news on June the 9th, 2025. Coming up, the water crisis deepens as Scotland looks set to renege on a deal to pipe water south. We ask, are President Sturgeon's threats more than just hot air? Fury in Westminster as farmers protest they're being forced out of business by the government's national water strategy. With rocketing food prices and wilting crops, is enough being done to beat the drought? And with school holidays just around the corner, we look at the scandal of Britain's beaches. Pollution levels are rising as fast as the mercury, so paddling is off the agenda. In Edinburgh, a row has broken out over how much England should pay for what President Sturgeon is calling Scotland's water. Prime Minister Johnson has accused Miss Sturgeon of profiteering while London wilts. Following 3 years of drought, it was believed a deal had been reached for England to import more water from the newly independent Scotland. Construction of a megapipe from the Highlands to the Midlands was due to begin this summer, but Prime Minister Johnson is claiming new terms are putting the agreement in jeopardy. Scotland's one of the few European countries with a resource surplus and is determined to replace its dwindling oil revenues with income from water in what's been dubbed the rush for blue gold. Income from hydroelectric power is up threefold. And since independence was granted 5 years ago, several manufacturing companies have moved production north of the border due, they claim, to more reliable water supplies. In a statement, President Sturgeon suggested the Prime Minister was simply jealous of Scotland's growing economic independence. We have what every nation needs, and we won't be blackmailed into giving it away for free. There were angry scenes today outside the Department for Water, Food and Energy as farmers burned copies of the government's updated national water strategy. Frustration's growing that not enough is being done to protect English agriculture in the face of the worst drought in a century. Farming groups hit back at Minister's latest guidance on who should have priority access to the South East's scarce water resources. In a statement, the National Farming Alliance said,
"The government is trying to deprive farmers of water when we grow the food people eat, and their needs should be put before those of the environment."
Farmers previously welcomed the government's reform of the abstraction system, part of its drive to increase competition in the water industry, under which they could sell their excess water to utility companies. But with 3 years of drought showing no sign of abating and England's reserves running low, farmers now feel this arrangement desperately needs revising. Meanwhile, 37 people have now been prosecuted for breaking the hosepipe ban. And in Manchester, a man remains in hospital after being attacked by a neighbour for watering his garden under cover of darkness. On the day, the Centre for Cities said Milton Keynes' population could reach 750,000 by 2030, 10 years earlier than predicted. Long queues formed outside a sales office for the city's latest development. 1,000 homes are to be built on the site of the former Abbey Hill golf course, plus a retail park, schools and doctors' surgeries, all wired in from day one to the MK smart grid, as the city seeks to rival Dubai as the most connected conurbation on the planet. The city's rapid growth is being put down to improved infrastructure and the smart grid, which residents claim saves them time, money and energy every day. The UK's largest power company is to cut jobs in its contact centre from 700 to just 75. The remaining staff will deal with customer complaints and queries only via social media, and the contact centre will be a phone-free zone. Gencor says the cuts help them keep pace with technology trends and increase efficiency. Each employee will be expected to deal with up to 4 different customers at any one time. Speculation is building about who'll emerge as the dominant player in the brand new energy market, often called generating power from poo. Earlier this year, Ofwat told the water industry it could no longer retain its monopoly on treating sludge, with the aim of driving down household energy bills. Radical technical innovations have led to a rash of startups around the country, with several contenders locked into battle with local water companies to attract the nation's waste. Faced with such cutting-edge competition, the established water companies risk losing their market dominance. Ofwat said it was pleased innovation and competition was finally being brought to an area of business where it felt no natural monopoly existed. And finally, none of the East Coast's beaches has managed to hang on to its blue flag this year, with potentially serious consequences for the region's tourism industry. Many are blaming Eastern Water for discharging raw sewage into the sea at popular resorts like Clacton and Southend. The accusation comes hot on the heels of a £4 million fine levied on the company for a pollution incident last year. Eastern admits an increase in flash flooding has often overwhelmed its sewers, and regulator Ofwat is examining whether the company managed to meet the promises in its 2020 business plan. If Eastern Water comes up short, Ofwat has pledged to claw back even more money on behalf of customers. Eastern claims in mitigation that extreme rainfall also washed high levels of pollution from towns and farms into the water, and that the regulator's harsh determination back in 2020 left it short of cash to maintain vital equipment. The tourism industry claims these are inadequate excuses when so many small businesses fear they're facing ruin. Eastern has yet to reply. And that's it for this morning. Don't forget our drought special tonight and regular updates online. From News 2025, for now, goodbye.
So that is a bit of fun. It's a little bit of silliness. We like nowadays to try and kind of always start our interactions with something a bit more interesting and engaging, to show that actually water has moved on slightly. And it's a film that we put together for training our own staff as much as anything else. But everything in there has got real direct relevance, whether you're talking about, moving water between different countries and the political issues that could have, the energy that we generate from, it's a bit early to be talking about some of these things, the solid matter, that we gather back from you, and we generate something like 100 gigawatt hours of electricity every year now through combined heat and power plants, taking that solid product and creating gas out of it to generate electricity through combined heat and power plants. Whether it's the risk of extreme weather, and I know we've got flooding in some areas today because of the rainfall we've had over the last couple of days, and whether the system that's been designed on a very specific set of parameters around the way our weather used to be, and how much it will cost to change that infrastructure. So we're talking about 80,000 kilometres of sewer network. So, think about how much that would cost to totally refit that over time. And the issues of competition, which I'll get on to in a minute. So, this talk is really about thinking about that future, which, is not actually that far away. And then talking about the kind of things we're doing already to take us to that position. So, I will just start up with the kind of the global perspective, a little bit like Keith did. So we'll go global, we'll go local, and then we'll become more and more specific as we go through. So you showed some pictures already about the amount of water that's available on the earth, and I had a talk with a fantastic international company who are really interested in their water footprint globally, and they use this slide, so I've stolen it off them because I just think it's a fantastic way of illustrating water. So the big blob there is if all the water on the earth kind of sucked up into a drop, that is the entire total of water on earth. That's all the fresh water, that one there, and then you can just see that tiny little drop there. That's the available fresh water. So that's just putting into perspective the figures that you showed earlier. And the really interesting fact, and I don't normally talk to notes, but I've got a couple of facts and figures on paper, so excuse me. The really interesting thing for me is there's less water on Earth than there is on Jupiter's moon Titan, which we think we're a very, very wet planet. We think there's an abundance of this resource. We think, particularly in the east of England or in the UK, water's not an issue. We have plenty of water. We have the same rainfall as Jerusalem in the east of England. So it's something we need to overcome. And we tend to only think of water, particularly in the UK, around extreme situations. So, during times of drought or during times of flooding. But actually, the infrastructure that we need to put in place to manage those extremes is becoming more and more important. And these, still on a global scale, these are some of the challenges that we're facing. So, in business, and I do a lot of work with an organisation, one of Prince Charles's organisations called Business in the Community, and we're constantly focusing on this thing called the 9 billion challenge. So it's the challenge of having 9 billion people on Earth and how we're going to manage that, considering the Earth's carrying capacity. And by 2050, we'll be using 2.3 planets worth of resources if we carry on the way we do today. And that's, that's the average, taking the developing and the developed world, which is pretty horrific. And, there are lots of these tools that you can use online. I think WWF have got a really good One Planet living calculator, and you can put in your own kind of activities and see how many planets worth of resources that you're using. And I, who consider myself fairly sustainable, are still using over 1 planet's worth of resources. So there's a big challenge out there. In the next 40 years, we need to produce as much food as in all of history up to now. So the exponential growth that we're dealing with is amazing. But I think there's another fact that there are more people living today than everyone who's ever died, added up together, which is a kind of a mind-blowing statistic. And the demand for electricity, so this could double by 2050, risk of an energy gap equivalent to the total market today, so or 2000. So, there's some big global... Sorry, that's a bit depressing, isn't it? I'm very much a glass half full kind of person. So I genuinely believe that, when pressure is applied to the natural system, and we're part of that natural system, we can adapt and find solutions to get out of this, which is why we're talking about longer-term future. So a bit more depressing stuff, and then we'll get on to happier stuff. And from an economic perspective, this is really being noticed now. And this is actually last year's World Economic Forum risk report. But there's a new one just out. But I left this one on there because this looks at global risks in terms of likelihood, global risks in terms of impact. And for the first time last year, water crises made it to the top of the risk list internationally in terms of impact. And that's the founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum saying, a shared understanding of challenges is needed as a base for multi-stakeholder collaboration. And we're seeing the increasing recognition that this is the most effective way to address global risks and build resilience. Resilience is a key word through all of this. And it comes back to what you were saying about the Water Framework Directive. We can't work in silos anymore. The challenge is far too great. And if we don't collaborate together, I don't know, it sometimes can sound like management babble coming out. But multi-stakeholder collaboration is the only way forward. And this was just a graphic that was used by the previous chief scientific advisor to the UK government, which was bringing it really into focus as a perfect storm of energy, food, water, and the pressures of climate change there. The increased energy demand that the world is going to need, the increased food production that the world is going to need, and the increased water demand. And actually, they're all interlinked. So when we talk about water to customers or if my teachers are going into the schools to talk about water, we're trying to help people understand the connection, because we tend to think about water as in, the water that you would buy from us. And that's what people think. Turn tap on, nice clean drinking water, hopefully comes out, you drink it, you do whatever else you need to do. As we were talking about earlier, it goes back into the system, we recycle it, and it goes back into the rivers. We might well then take it back out again shortly. But we don't tend to think about the water connections with food, with energy, and with everything. Everything, this table, this tray, this, the glass, whatever it is, has some embodied water in it. So, not wanting to labour the point, but we are under kind of water stress already. So, you know, the redder the patch, the more water stressed we are. And it was interesting you described me as a water industry person and Ben as somebody from business, because that's not, I spend most of my time now talking to businesses, talking to big international businesses about water and trying to bring water up the agenda. And why do I do that? Well, because we have big businesses working in this region. We have PepsiCo, we have Nestle, we have, you know, all sorts of Adnams. We have big players, and they need to understand the risks and the implications to their business about water, both in terms of having too much water and flooding, but primarily, you know, in understanding the water resource implications. And we've had really detailed and interesting conversations with some of them about, you know, can they continue to make their products in certain areas, because is there going to be enough water for them? You know, if you're going to invest tens of millions of pounds in a factory, is the water going to be there and available for them to do that in the future? And, you know, luckily at the moment in the UK, that's, you know, it's all fine. In other areas of the world, they are starting to really think about where, you know, investment is made and where jobs and wealth is put, depending on where there's enough water. So if you know, look at some of the activities of Coca-Cola or other big water users around the globe, they're really starting to think about this as it's really becoming a key critical risk. Have a look at some of their annual report and accounts and you'll see that. Water and power, you know, another big one, and I'm sure everybody recognises that straight away. So that's I won't attempt to pronounce it, particularly as I'm on film. But this is the Three Gorges Dam in China, and that's or it certainly was when I put the slide together, was the biggest power station in the world. It's the second in terms of the amount of electricity it generates, you know, and in terms of green electricity, an incredibly important resource, but the water implications, the knock-on water implications and the social implications and environmental implications are another thing. But, you know, it's important to think about how water is used in generating electricity, whether it's, you know, fossil fuel electricity or renewables. So gas-fired power stations actually use the least amount of water per unit of energy. Coal and oil use twice as much. Nuclear about 3 times as much. So water has to kind of be part of that understanding and that balance as well. And then water and food, we've kind of touched on this already, but the implications of climate change and the way kind of agriculture will need to adapt to that. And, you know, in some places it will be better, in some places it will be worse. I've not heard about that. I've not kind of twigged the dry get drier, the wet get wetter. That's a nice way of just remembering it. But that's, you know, this is just one report that's available out there looking at the impact on crops by 2050 of the projected water and how it's limiting or could limit crop yield. But it's interesting to think about the amount of water required, and I'm sure Ben will tell us exactly how much water is required for a pint of each of the individual different brews at Adnams. But it's up to 20,000 litres per kilogram of coffee created. Less for tea. So, you know, tea from a water perspective is better. It's only about 2,200 litres for a kilo of tea. Kilo of beef. We could play this as a game if you wanted, but we do that with some of the children sometimes. 16,000 litres for a kilo of beef. About 5,500 litres for a kilo of pork. Rice, 2,500 litres. Potatoes, only 130 litres on average, although they want it at a very specific time, particularly in the east of England. And, you know, we've been in times of stress. The Environment Agency have come to us and said, you know, can we manage our abstractions because they need the water for the potato crop because it will fail, you know, in those particular 6-week periods. So, you know, yeah, you know, just trying to get into your mind that water isn't just about what comes out of the tap. It's kind of so ingrained in almost everything we do. So there you go. That's the kind of worry, depressing stuff, and we'll move on to some of the other stuff. But I just thought worth putting up a slide about the kind of context of change that we're facing in the industry today. There you go. We've got Brexit on there as well. So just to, get a few facts and figures up there. I mean, the big issue around, is the infrastructure in the industry resilient to climate change? There's Rory Stewart, who's the Environment and Water Minister, there out at the latest floods last year. But that's being picked up in all sorts of reports at the moment, and there's some facts and figures on there. From the CBI report, which came out recently, so 6 to 11% reduction in availability of water by 2050, 2.1 million, the potential number of properties at risk from flooding by 2050. So these are the kind of big changes that we're having to deal with from a kind of physical point of view. The changes in consumer power and the way we interact with our consumers. We have more interaction with customers today through Twitter and Facebook than we do by any other means. So that's totally changed the way that we think about communicating with customers. And then changes in the water market. So this is the first hands up question. So hands up if you know that for businesses from next year, the market is going to be open to competition. So how many of you knew that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 of you. So so at the moment, water is a monopoly, and if you are a business within the Anglian water region, and we have a weird region because we have other water companies within the wider region, but if you're within our water region, you have to buy your water from us. Next year, in April, you don't. So Asda can buy their water from Scottish Water right across the UK if they want to. And for them that would be, beneficial because they get a single bill, they get a single interaction rather than for every Asda store around. So I'll use Asda as just plucking them out of my mind. They would have to buy their water from Severn Trent in Severn Trent area or Thames or wherever. So that's opening up. So that's going to be interesting, and all the water companies are preparing for that change, and it should be a positive thing. It's supposed to generate kind of better value for those customers and new innovations. With my climate change hat on, I think, the water company that is looking after the resource still has to have a conversation with those big water users in terms of long-term planning, because the Asda down the road here might be buying their water and paying their bill through Scottish Water, but the physical water is coming from Anglian Water. So we need to know and plan for the kind of infrastructure going forward. So there's all sorts of operating systems being put in behind the scenes, and you can go and have a look at those for yourselves. I wasn't going to bore you. That's a completely different lecture, and there'll be far fewer people in here, I'm sure. Right, so second, hands up. Hands up if you knew that is potentially what's going to happen for all of you as household customers. Did anyone know that? 1. Go on, you did put your hand up, I saw. So, out of the blue, this was announced by the Chancellor last year, and he said that Ofwat needed to do an investigation and report on those findings this year as to whether or not we should open the market up for domestic competition, and then those changes should be implemented by the end of this 5-year cycle. So Ofwat are doing that at the moment, and the Consumer Council for Water, who are the customer group for water, are doing some survey work themselves on the changes to that and what the benefits of that will be. So I just throw that into the mix. So water is not static. The system that we're dealing with at the moment is not static. So I'll leave that with you. I'm sure we can have some questions on that later. So this is the context that we're trying to manage this resource with those long-term challenges that we face. Right. So local impacts. Just going through those again. We had the driest 18 months on record back in kind of 2012. Our population set to grow by 20% by 2040. Lots of high quality agricultural and arable land likely to be flooded at least once every 3 years by the 2050s with all the changes. So we're dealing with a lot of changes here too. And our population is growing and growing. So as well as climate change and the pressures that might put on us, we're also going to face pressures of more people wanting to live in the region and the kind of changing way that people are living as well. Agriculture, hugely important for our region, and we mustn't ever forget that, both in terms of the wealth that it generates, but also the fact that it produces vast percentages of the food that we eat, whether that's wheat or potatoes, sugar, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. So, there is an important element of water needed to maintain that. And the water in the natural ecosystems, incredibly important in this part of the region. Huge numbers of sites of special scientific interest that are reliant on water. And as we said, we've got to manage all of these things in increasingly variable and extreme conditions. So, who would have thought, the 2011-2012 drought would go straight into the wettest period on record as well, and the kind of issues and implications that we had in trying to manage that. And we are lucky in our region, as you said, we have about a 50-50 split between groundwater resources and kind of surface water. So, our big reservoirs, our big winter storage reservoir systems run on a 3-year basis, so we can deal with 2 really dry winters. And then when you get into a third dry winter, which is unusual if you look at history, that's when we start to have problems. However, that is what we've got to start thinking about as we go forward. What are we going to do with consecutive 3 dry winters, and how do we manage that? We've done a bit of climate change, I'll skip over that. And from a regional perspective, those are the things that we're really interested in as a company. So growth and climate change and the impacts on the region, agricultural food production, innovation and new technology, and how can that generate benefits, and then not forgetting the environmental and social quality of life in our region. So what do we need to do as a 21st century water company, or any of the water companies need to do to get over this? Well, we have stopped thinking about ourselves within our own operational boundaries, and this is kind of the way we talk about water and the company now. We've got to put water at the heart of a whole new way of living, and that's a soft way of saying we've got to get it into people's thinking, we've got to get it into decision making, we've got to get water on the agenda, because without water, we don't have manufacturing, we don't have agriculture, we don't have recreation and tourism. I can't remember the figures, but you can last a great deal longer without any food than you can do with water, and I think it's something like 2 days without water will lead to civil unrest. So, water should be at the heart of what we're all doing. So as a company and as an industry, we started to really try and look further ahead and think about the longer term visions and the outcomes that a company delivering this vital resource should have. So this is our version, but every other water company has got a similar set of what we call outcomes. So these are not the kind of business plan next couple of years targets. These are longer term aspirational targets. And these are things that we put out to our customers in the run up to the last price review. So we work on a 5-year investment cycle. And from those, we turn those into internal goals about how we're going to, what are the milestones to delivering those. And then that's just a kind of an internal memory for our own people to think about. The vision is putting water right at the heart of the way of living. The outcomes are the long-term aspirations we've agreed with the customers. To get to those, we've got to deliver on all our goals, and to do it, we've got to be innovative, we've got to collaborate, and actually we've got to change an old business into a much more agile business. I'm conscious of the time, but as you were 10 minutes over, I'm going to eke into my 10 minutes, if that's okay. So the two critical bits around water resource management planning. We plan on a 25-year cycle for water resources, and that's incredibly important, becoming more and more important. And we do the same for drought, because that's the thing that's going to feed into the decisions around infrastructure. And in the old days, we would have done that, taking information from the Environment Agency. We would have sat in pretty much a closed room to think about those things, and then we would have perhaps put it out to consultation to a small number of people and then get it signed off by the agency and government. Well, we don't do that anymore, and I'll come on to the way it's really changing. But if you look at the details of the Water Resource Management Plan, and it's about a 360-page document, and it's on the web, and if anyone wants to read it, actually it's quite accessible. If you're interested in just your area, you can go to that particular area at the back. But this looks at population growth, the climate projections, which we've been feeding into the management planning process for the last 15 years or so. And then it looks at those supply zones and says, well, what are the variables and what have we got to try and manage? And in the kind of average case, we're looking at trying to find another 125 megalitres a day for headroom. We've got to get rid of 79 megalitres a day where that is potentially damaging environmentally sensitive sites, so that's called sustainability reductions. And then we've got to find another 50 megalitres a day because of the climate change variability that we've seen already. However, in the worst case scenario, it's a lot higher than that, and that's taking the worst climate change projections and the highest growth figures for the region. So there's a significant deficit in there at the end of that 25-year period. And we've got to think about that in a twin-track approach. And this is where we are starting to think very, very differently. So we've been working for some time with a number of other organisations to say, well, the way we used to do things probably isn't the best way of doing that anymore, and how can we do things differently? So part of a solution may well be building another reservoir in the future, but they're incredibly expensive to build. So if we were going to build another reservoir, how would we do that, and what would it do? And this, it's very simply kind of saying you would create a multi-stakeholder, multifunctional reservoir. So, if we all need water, why not be creating one that can support agricultural needs and environmental needs at the same time, and all come together and decide where you put it, and maybe we'll fund it in a different way, and maybe we'll operate it in a different way. So there was some studies that went on with the Cambridge Natural Capital Leaders Platform and Cambridge University to look at that, and that involved farming organisations and economists and big businesses as well, and finance institutions to look at that, to try and create a joined up plan. We've now taken that forward to create something with a fairly similar name to your own. So WREA stands for Water Resource East Anglia. So this is a look at the entire region and bringing in all the right stakeholders and all the water companies that interact with that and the regulators together to say, well, okay, what's the resource plan for the region? And if we're going to be investing large amounts of customers' money in the future, where is the best, well, where do we really need the water? Where do we need the infrastructure, and what's the best infrastructure to go there? Whether it is aquifer recharge or desalination or another reservoir, let's come together and really think about this as an entire unit, rather than Anglian Water will do our plan, Thames Water will do their plan, Severn Trent will do their plan, Essex and Suffolk will do their plan. So this has been established and is now operating with an independent chair who comes from an agricultural background, actually. And the idea of this is to do that research to plug into the next investment cycle. And, there's some opportunities. So, as I say, nothing's off the table. Artificial recharge, desalination, reservoir reuse, they're all up there. And we're talking, AMP means Asset Management Planning Round. That's a 5-year period. So we're in AMP 6 at the moment through to 2020. So we're looking kind of into the long term. So that's kind of water resources. Mustn't forget the other side, the dirtier side, which we now refer to as water recycling. We don't talk about wastewater or sewage anymore. Basically, it's a resource that we're taking back from you, treating, to get it back into the system, because we sit in the middle of a water cycle, so it's not a waste product. It's something that's got to go back into the system. I could do a whole different presentation on the environmental aspects, but a lot of these, and the film already picked up some of these. But the thing that we're particularly interested in, again, is to look outside our barriers and to look at catchment management and to work with different organisations across the agriculture and food production industry to say, how do we manage some common challenges together? And this has led to, again, a totally different way of working, and that's our coastal and catchment manager, and that's one of our new senior kind of farm advisors, agronomists. So we've brought in expertise from the agricultural sector to go out and work with the agricultural community, because if we don't understand and talk to them in the way they want to be talked about, we can't solve any of the problems. And really, Slug It Out is about a particular pesticide issue, a thing called metaldehyde. So metaldehyde is the main constituent of many slug pellets, and that is something that we can't break down in the treatment process. So when it gets into the water, the raw water, the groundwater, it's very, very, very difficult for us to get it back out again, and there are European limits on what is acceptable in drinking water. It's not dangerous, it's not harmful to humans, but there is still a limit set on it. So we're working with the agricultural community through our set of catchment advisors to try and substitute different chemicals and work with them. And we're actually running the biggest slug pellet pesticide substitution program, because there's a cost difference between that chemical and the one we'd rather people use. But it's starting to have positive effects, which is good. We're running a pesticide amnesty with farmers at the moment, a kind of completely full amnesty, so that we don't know which farmers. We have a broker that goes and collects chemicals that they want to get rid of, that perhaps they shouldn't have because they're not legal anymore. And again, because we're picking all sorts of strange things up in our monitoring. And again, this has just been extended because this has worked incredibly well and is delivering a very cost-effective solution for us. So rather than having to treat things at the end of the pipe, we want to get out there into the landscape and work with the communities to manage their inputs instead, much more cost-effective. And that collaboration hopefully leading to a much more integrated way of working together in the future. And we run a catchment partnership called Cameo, so that's the Cam and Ely Ouse partnership, which we run with the Rivers Trust, so a lot of good work. And a lot of interesting others coming into that. So Sainsbury's are involved in that, British Sugar are involved in that as well now. And getting on to customers, again, here's where I'll quickly just ask for your kind of hands up in the air. Who actually knows where their water comes from? Do you, not the reservoir or whatever, but the source of water, whether it's coming out of a particular river or a wetland? Not many. Well, that's normally I get about 10%. Yeah. Oh, you're not on. Okay. So, fair enough. That's one of the problems. So that's something I'm really passionate about and trying to push internally, that we help people connect with where their water comes from. So if you don't know where your water comes from, I guess not many hands will go up if I say, well, where does your water go to? So when you flush, when you've done what you've wanted to do with it, do you know where it goes back and joins the water cycle? Because that is, a hand, excellent. That's so important. And this is a particular bit of work that we've been doing with customers around that aspect, the dirtier aspect, because, we are spending, and there's some horrible slides I could have put up, but I thought I wouldn't. So that's fat congealing within the sewer pipe. And we spend tens of millions of your money on having to clean out those sewers before they burst. Or if you get a blockage, it's going one of two ways. One's coming out somewhere in your house and you do not want that. And the other is it's going to either block a pump, burst a manhole, go into a watercourse, go into a playground, go onto a farmer's field. We don't want that either. So again, this is a thing called Keep It Clear, which is about connecting customers with their actions in the home and saying, you know, when you're draining your tin of environmentally friendly tuna in olive oil, don't drain it down the sink, because you may well think that that's fluid and is going to sit in the pipes, but I can tell you it won't as it cools down. If you've ever put olive oil in the fridge, you know exactly how it will congeal. And those things that say they're flushable, that you flush down the toilets, because Andrex tell you that you have never been cleaner until you've used one, they will hook onto a bit of something in the pipe, and they will act like a, you know, the bit of grit in an oyster, and you will get a big fat pearl around it. So Keep It Clear is our attempt to look at the causes of some of this issue with our customers rather than just deal with the symptoms the whole time. And we have tens of thousands of avoidable blockages every year. And this is something that we've been running in a number of different hotspots around the region. And we've seen, take Peterborough was the launch site, where we had a very interesting series of activities trying to bring this to life for people. We've reduced avoidable blockages there over an extended period, over about 3 years, by 90%. So that's saving us and you money, because we're not having to go and flush the system or having to go in and deal with the mop-up of the mess. And we're starting.
Why did you choose Peterborough?
We chose Peterborough because there was a particular issue at the time. It's very local to our head office, where we wanted to do some really in-depth behavioural change research work with communities, because it's challenging. Apparently there's 104 different languages used in Peterborough, and we wanted to see whether it worked. So I haven't got time to show you this, but this was a bit of 4D projection mapping. At lunchtime I'll play it for anyone who's interested. Up on the I think it's the Guild Hall in the middle of Peterborough. We didn't tell anyone we were doing this. We just did it one September, and it's a kind of mapping. If any of you watched the Queen's birthday celebrations, and they did a big projection on the front of Buckingham Palace and doors open. It's like that. We did it first. They got the idea from Keep It Clear. But we're seeing around a 50% reduction across the region where we have been doing this. And I believe Keep It Clear is coming to Norwich later this year. So look out for some interactive fun. We ran pantos this year, trying to bring this, because it's not easy talking about fog and fats, oils and greases and poo and pollution to people. It's a hard thing to engage in. So we're trying to find different ways of engaging with them and then provide solutions. So behind all of the kind of communications is the work with the local authorities about where fat, oils, grease ought to go. And behind that is all the work with the manufacturers of the stuff. So we're working with some of the supermarkets to say, well, if we're asking people to save their oil and not pour it down the drains, what can we do with that? So can we get that collected? Can we generate electricity from it? Can you turn it into biofuels? And, other water companies, it's not just us, so other water companies are doing this as well. The same with the wipes manufacturers. Can we create a standard for what can actually degrade? Because a non-flushable wipe that may well say it's flushable on it takes 6,000 times longer than toilet paper to degrade, and it doesn't take 6,000 times longer to get to the pump, which it wraps around, stops from working, causes a pollution incident. And we're doing the same kind of things with water as well, water efficiency. So we're looking at how do we help customers in the home think about the water that they're using. So we're looking at smart metering technology. These are some in-house displays that we've trialled in certain areas so that you've got water right, in front of where you're using it, which will tell you, how much in terms of litres, how much in terms of cost that you're using every day. And then doing some other kind of innovative work in other places. And there's some of my education team kind of bringing water to life. conscious of time, I'm going to skip over some of the work we do with communities and the business plan I've already talked about already. So quick, just a couple of seconds on looking to the future. I mentioned kind of innovation and technology, and we talked about desalination, but what else is there? And we're really interested in working with other people. We set up this thing called the Water Innovation Network for young kind of entrepreneurial startups, and we put challenges out on that to say, well, here's an issue, what are your thoughts on that? It's kind of approach to crowdsourcing. And this thing up here is a thing called the Dutch Rainmaker, which is what you might call disruptive technology. So this is an off-grid kind of water system powered by renewable energy. So they've done some field trials with this turbine in Kuwait, I think this one is, and it's an AW75 turbine, and that through an innovative process actually condenses moisture out of the air and can create 7,500 litres of clean water a day whilst generating green electricity. So what if that's out there being used in Kuwait, what are the opportunities for using that in different areas? Also with managing our landscapes differently, can we use more of that water more effectively? Can we manage our own systems? This is our optimized water networks, changing pressure in the system and managing pressure differently. Can we prevent leaks and therefore save water? And then, working with academic institutions. We have a very close relationship with UEA at the moment. Who knows, these are some concept designs out there. Again, this kind of, condensing technology out in the desert, creating clean water. We don't know what's out there kind of in the future, and we don't know what future homes will look like in terms of, their management of water. If we were going to design drinking water today, we certainly wouldn't do it with the system that we've got now so that you're flushing your toilet with perfectly good, clean drinking water. So, I've rattled through that last bit rather quickly because I was very conscious of the time. We're putting some of this innovation into a single area, actually, which is not far away from here, because we want to try and set ourselves some extra tough targets and bring all of our innovation into one space to really see if that can generate some breakthroughs. So that'll be quite interesting. And we're also working with some cities on some smart technology, looking at how we can get customers talking to each other and thinking about their water usage as a community. So a thing called the Water Monitor there is getting communities understanding and creating competition between customers about how you can be more water efficient. And that's our journey, and that's what we're investing in. You don't really want to know about that. But basically, that's what we're trying to get to. So I rattled through some of it. I can take a few questions now, or because we've overrun, we can take questions later, and I'm here for the rest of the day.
Okay, but thank you very much.
I'll just start by introducing myself. So I work at the University of East Anglia. I work in the same department as Kevin. I also have a contract at the University of Exeter. And I just want to make sure that I thank all my people that I work with, because I work with a lot of different sorts of people. So just to make it clear, and this is to preempt any technical questions you might want to ask me. I'm a biologist. I did a biology degree in Cardiff, and then I did my PhD in Atlantic salmon. This is an Atlantic salmon parr from the River Frome. And I did spend quite a lot of time standing in rivers while the fish people collected fish and put them in the bucket. But I was a molecular ecologist, so I did genetic population structure of salmon. I'm not talking about that today, but I'm just letting you know who I am and why I might not be able to answer all of your questions. So just to reiterate, so I'm at the UEA, work on the Agritech water cluster with Kevin, also Exeter, where I work with colleagues who are environmental economists, and I'm also part of the UK Water Partnership. I think probably I might speak for about 20 minutes and then let you have a chance for some questions. So I'll split my talk up, but I don't want to overrun, so I can skip some of it, but I do have a film to show at the end. So what I'd like to do is really to focus on working in partnership, Both Kevin and Andy have talked a bit about all the big global issues we've got in the world, and it's all a bit depressing. But I'd like to give you a couple of quite small scale, but I think positive examples of where academics and water companies and farmers can work together just to try and at least show how we could start to solve some of these problems. So I've got two examples, one on dairy farming in the West Country, and the other on the Slug It Out, which is Andy's already mentioned, which is back up here in East Anglia. So I'll start with the West Country one. So this is dairy farmers in Cornwall. Has anyone ever been on holiday? This is near Foy. Yeah, excellent. So if you're sort of familiar, so this is Cornwall, this is the Foy, and this is the River Foy. Provides pretty much all of the water for Devon and Cornwall. So it's quite a small catchment. It's not very big, so we're probably talking about a 50-kilometre upstream of the town there, of the Foy. And the water treatment's just a bit upstream of the town of Foy. So it's a small area. It's got a lot of farmers. I think there's about 200 farmers were identified in the catchment. And so these are tiny farmers. So these are people with maybe even like 10 cows. So they're small dairy farmers. And as you know, of course, dairy farming is not always very profitable. And these are farmers that are, fairly on the edge of keeping their living there. So they sometimes might have issues on their farms. For example, direct application of nutrients into the headstreams of the river here. So this is quite interesting because the farmers aren't always quite sure. Obviously, logically, they know that flows down into the river. But often, and it's the same here, that farmers aren't always convinced that their little stream on their land does actually add up and affects the whole of the river. And this is the yard. So the other thing is dairy slurry is the issue, but also just like soil and dirt coming off. I should have mentioned this is with South West Water, the water company, and the West Country Rivers Trust, and they work together under this upstream thinking initiative, which is South West Water's sort of whole thing, everything that they do about non-engineering approaches to managing the water. So the issue, as I've just said, is that slurry, you don't want it in the water because obviously the water company can't supply you with water that's got slurry in it. You don't want to drink that, for sure. It's not allowed. And also, of course, that slurry is the fertiliser that the farmers want to apply back onto their own land to improve their grassland, to improve their cows' nutrition. And there are regulations. We talked about EU regulations, that all of this is controlled by regulations. What the farmers should do is to store that slurry. I think they should have 4 months' worth of slurry. They shouldn't supply it. They shouldn't reapply it to the land in the winter. They should save it and spread it on a nice sunny day in the spring. But of course, anyone who's been to the West Country knows it's a bit wet down there. So basically, South West Water, this is now going back 4 years, I think. They put forward several £1 million worth of money across their whole of their upstream catchment project, their upstream thinking project. And they can use this money because it's their own company money, customers' money, to pay farmers directly to upgrade their farm infrastructure. And these are the sorts of things that they're paying the farmers to do. So it's very straightforward. Basically, anything that keeps the slurry off on the land and out of the river. So they could update their slurry storage. They can put big sheds for the cattle to live in the winter. Separate the rainwater off that to keep that, so it doesn't run through the waste products of the cows. And just sort of tidying up and concreting the yards. So this is where myself and colleagues who were at UEA, now at Exeter University, what they had been doing was that the West Country Rivers Trust, environmental people, they were going out to the farmers and meeting farmers and seeing what sort of issues each farmer had on their land. And when they found an investment opportunity for the water company, they would then say, on this farm, we'll give you half of the cost. So it was a new slurry storage, the water company would pay half, the farmer would pay half. And the farmers are familiar with that half-half system because that's what they get from these government schemes. So that sort of 50% was fairly well understood. However, there appeared to be some discretion. So some farmers could say, actually, I can't quite afford the 50%. And then this had obviously got around the farming community that some people had got a little bit more money from the water company. So between myself and colleagues and the water company, we came up with the idea of running the next round of this as a competitive auction. So this was saying all the dairy farmers were above, where their farms ran into the river, above the water treatment works, were invited to take part. And then we invited the farmers to Pie and Pint evenings, which is, sounds like not too much hard work. But after 4 days of eating these pies, it was quite a lot of pies. We did this. So this is the first. So auctions have been done. They've been run in Australia, not quite in the same way. Nothing like this had ever been run in the UK before. So we ummed and ahed about what amount of information that the farmers should know. So we did discuss this, but we came up with the idea that the farmers should definitely have a limit of what they can apply for per farm, and that was 50k. 50k would buy you a full slurry tank, so that's a big amount of money for these farms. And in addition, we couldn't decide whether to let them know this total or not, but again, we decided it would be best to, so that they knew that the water company had got 360k in total. So farmers were starting to think about the level of competition that they might be up against, because they know, obviously, everyone in the catchment pretty much knows each other. They know how many farms there are, they know how much a bigger pot they can ask for, and they knew how much they could ask for per farm. But obviously the point of running it as an auction was to encourage the farmers, so the farmers could ask for any amount, so they could ask for the full amount from the water company, or they could decide how much of their own money they could put in. But obviously the aim of doing it as an auction is to make sure that we get best value for money for the water company that's paying for it, and ultimately the customers that are paying for it. So the water company wants to get the most amount of environmental improvement, most river water, best water quality for their money. And just, I won't go into exactly the details of it, but basically the farmers had, let's just go back to the last slide. We basically sent them this in the post with this, just a tick box, say I want some money for this slurry storage system. I'll put in this amount of money. I'm asking for X amount from the water company, percentage each way. And then they'd submit those forms to us, and we'd run it in several rounds. And we fed back to the farmers after each round of whether they were or weren't likely to get funding under their current ask. And then obviously over time, we ran that in the 3 rounds. We saw that their ask from the water company went down, and the amount that they wanted to put in, or that they were prepared to put in, went up. So I'll just skip through that again. So this is just, this is exactly the same place. So this is to say that they had about a year, the farmers had to pay for all the work themselves up front, and then they could claim the money back from the water company. And this is fairly simple stuff. It's just fencing to keep the cows out of the river. Here's the cattle enjoying their winter undercover, enjoying some nice straw there to eat. And then this is like, farmers seem to be quite keen on tidying the farm. So, they were quite happy to get money to concrete the farm. And the main point of this is that, again, to keep that mud and all the manure separate and keep it in a stored area so it doesn't just get washed off the farm. So that's a really brief overview of that work, and that was, I think, in 2012 that we did that. So Andy mentioned that water companies work in these 5-year timeframes. So that's back in the previous timeframe. This type of catchment approach is something that most of the water companies are doing in various different ways. And so over that time, I've been trying to engage Anglian Water, and just to see the sort of work that Anglian were thinking of doing. And this is going to be talking about the slug it out, which Andy's already mentioned. So as you know from driving around and living in the area, these are the sorts of, so we're not a massive dairy area. Arable is the main crops here. So we've got corn, wheat, potatoes, and the lovely oilseed rape. I'm very allergic to it, it's horrible stuff. And again, Andy's already mentioned, because those crops are very intensively grown, you don't want to eat your brassicas with slugs and all sorts of nasty things in, and also when the wheat grows up, the slugs can eat the little seedlings. So farmers have to use products to control this. And I should make it really clear that the farmers are doing everything totally legally. So they're abiding by all the EU standards and regulations about how much they can use. But I'm just trying to make the point, and I think it's been made already, that just the amount of stuff that they apply compared to the amount of stuff that is legally allowed to be supplied in the tap water is a massive scale of difference. And Kevin showed a very detailed slide. I've got one that's just slightly simplifies this. So pesticides, absolutely you don't want to drink them, but farmers have to use them on their land. And I'm just going to talk specifically about the slug pesticide metaldehyde, which is this blue slug pesticide here. And I've kept on asking the farmers, I was like, I keep finding these pictures where the slug pellet is almost the size of the slug. And I was like, why do they eat them? Because it's an enormous thing. But apparently they're very, very palatable, and I don't know any more than that, but the slugs love to eat them. So they're very effective, but if there are any pellets left on the ground and then it rains, then you'll get some of that washing into the water. So the farmers are really aware that they have to use this, and they're very careful about how they use them. And there's a group called the Metaldehyde Stewardship Group, which has set guidelines, and they do training for the farmers, and Anglian Water's farm advisors also speak to farmers about best practice. So despite the fact that it's all legal, best practice, everyone knows what they're doing, it can still get into the water. So the limit for drinking water for pesticides is almost nothing. So it's almost like there's absolutely nothing in there. And in chemical terms, it's 0.1 micrograms per litre. So that's what's coming out of the tap, or lower. So Kevin mentioned his work, which is upstream on the River Wensum here. So that's, if you're familiar with Norfolk, it's near Reetham, sort of northwest from Norwich. So Kevin's got a very detailed monitoring project there where they monitor very, very fine detail all the sort of chemicals that the farmers are using and what ends up in the water. And I can't remember when this was, but they found this. So this is 50 times. Is this right? Yes. This is getting into the chemistry. So 50 times the amount that can be allowed to be provided to us is in the river coming off that farm. And the farmer can apply 210 grams per hectare per year. So this is, on a whole other scale again.
That was only in one storm.
Yes, it's not all the time. So this is not common, but it was just the reason I put the potatoes up there is that, and trying to emphasise this all about best practice, is there had been a previous pesticide that had been used on potatoes that had been banned, and that was due to, because it had a bad effect on birds, so that was a wildlife protection ban. But obviously now the farmers need another product for potatoes, so starting to use metaldehyde on potatoes. So it's really important to just to emphasise the point of partnership working, because some of the things you might say, well, just ban it then, but that's not always a great solution. So don't ask me why, but metaldehyde, because of its chemistry, is very, very difficult to treat with the treatment that water companies have. So Andy's mentioned this already, but I just wanted to show how it follows on from our previous work. So Anglian Water obviously has got lots of big reservoirs around the region, and this is very basic, but imagine a massive river here, and Anglian Water might be pumping in the water from the river, which is draining an enormous catchment, which may have all these pesticides coming into it, and then they going into, this is a holding reservoir. And again, don't ask me why, but metaldehyde doesn't break down naturally, so some other pesticides might, but metaldehyde doesn't. So if you've pumped it into your reservoir, it's sort of stuck there. So Anglian Water obviously had this very great idea, I think, which is fairly straightforward, is that around the reservoirs there'll be a certain area which drains in directly to the reservoir, called the natural catchment. And this is what the Slug It Out project is doing. So Anglian Water's farm advisors have been meeting and talking to farmers just in this moderate area around the reservoirs to talk to farmers, to understand what they're applying, when they're applying it, and to encourage them to move from using metaldehyde into using a different slug control chemical, which is called ferric phosphate. That's more expensive for the farmers to use, so it's very unlikely that farmers will swap to that of their own accord. Some farmers do, But also it's not as well used, so a lot of farmers are like, well, I've read about it, but I've never used it, I'm not quite sure if it's as effective. So again, this is where myself and colleagues who are environmental economists, we started to talk to colleagues at Anglian Water, and we were wondering about what's the best way to encourage the farmers to take part. So obviously metaldehyde is very different to slurry. With the slurry, every farm that you take out and that's not putting slurry is a step towards helping that issue. But because metaldehyde you need to get to such a low level, it could just be one farmer with a couple of pellets could take you over the limit in a sort of, say in an area this volume the size of this room, a couple of pellets would take you over that drinking water standard. So basically, we wanted to make sure that all of the farmers in those natural catchments were involved. And basically, this is a trial that's live now, this Slug It Out trial that Andy mentioned. It's basically just to test how to set that level of financial compensation for the farmers. So this is not just an issue in our region, Thames Water, other water companies have trialled this, but no one's done a trial, as far as I know, with such a large number of farmers, and to be honest, not quite as robustly scientifically set up as this one. And what we wanted to do is to see, you know, is this actually going to work in the sense of making sure that all those farmers are engaged in that scheme and that they stick to it. Andy's already shown you this. So this is just a bit more information. There's more about this on Anglian Water's website, Slug It Out. Great title. Anglian Water chose that. I think it's a fantastic name for it. So what I want to do is just have a quick break there before I talk to you about some of our other partnership projects and just see if you've got any questions on that specific research there.
So how many farmers around that particular reservoir then?
I think, if I recall, there's 6 reservoirs that are involved in the Slug It Out trial, and I think in total 80 farmers. 80? 80, yeah.
And
yeah.
Are they all cooperating?
Yeah, so that was the fantastic thing. So it took a lot of work by the Anglian Water farm advisors, went out again and again, meeting everybody. They met everybody in person on their farms, and everybody in those natural catchments who signed up.
Were they all bribed the same way as... I'm only using it as a... But were they all the financial incentive to do this?
Yes, so each farmer has been paid exactly the same amount per, so they're paid a fee to join, and then a fee per area, because the arable farms obviously are much bigger generally, so it's probably, because it's just around the reservoir, so it just maybe be 2 or 3 fields from each farm, they might have a huge farm that's outside of the catchment. So it's only paying obviously for the fields that are within the natural catchment.
What about gardeners using the slug pellets, and can they get hold of their phosphate to replace?
Yes, so I think so. This is again not my area, but I believe that it's the same product that you would use in your gardens. And this is something that the farmers, you know, again and again, they're like, well, what if we abide by everything? But you find that in, you know, if you're still finding metaldehyde, it must be the gardeners and those allotment holders. So this is one thing that this scheme, you know, because another thing I should have mentioned, Anglian Water have mapped this out in such a great amount of detail. So they've got very detailed knowledge of which tiny stream goes in where. So if there are any allotments or sort of houses in that, then they'll be able to see if that's coming off. So this will be useful because that will be able to put some actual evidence on that, you know, and save the farmers just keep saying, oh. Ferric phosphate, I don't know, is that available?
I don't know what they use, but Garden Organic, you know, the Henry Doubleday, you can buy non-toxic. We use them.
Oxfam sell them.
Yeah, so in little tubs for the garden, and they're very effective.
Ferromol is available in a form for the domestic market.
Sorry if I missed it. What does metaldehyde actually do? Why is it?
For the water company, as in why they can't treat it. Yeah, this is way beyond me, so I wonder if Andy might be able to explain.
What's the problem that it's in there?
So why is it a problem? It's an interesting one, because as I understand it, and I'm not a chemist, it's not, there's not a particular issue for human health, but there is a blanket approach to pesticide levels allowed in drinking water across the European Union. So it's an interesting one for the kind of Brexit debate. So that, I mean, that's where it comes from. The European Union set that particular limit, and then as a water company, we're just left with the challenge of trying to solve that. There are some ways of breaking it down, but they are hugely energy intensive and take quite a lot of time to do it. So if you imagine Grapham Water, which is our reservoir in Cambridgeshire, that supplies 1 million customers with water. So there is no technology that could treat the throughput, the flow of water, at the speed we need to get it through to customers at the moment. And it's just not the right thing to do, to try and tackle it at the end of the pipe when we could work with the farming community.
Why is it harmful then?
It's not, as far as I'm aware, it's not harmful to humans. But there is a stipulation at the European level that says, there should only any pesticide that's on the list can't appear in the treated
I believe it's harmful to other wildlife.
It's harmful to other wildlife. Yeah.
So therefore, if we leave it on the market, we can just ignore it.
Well, not
But it's not going to harm anybody. It's another one.
at that level, at the level that's been set. So I don't know what the there's not a lot of difference between different pesticides in terms of the level you've got to get it down to, because the decision was made that you've got to get it down to that low level for all pesticides on the list.
Yeah, these standards were set some years ago, and it was simply this 0.1 ppb was the lowest limit that the instruments could detect. So with further research, we could have limits that were based on eco-toxicological testing, but the EU takes the view that for now we should stick to a single
rather than
yes, which we don't want, do we?
Yeah.
There was one further question in here before we move on. Was it you, sir?
British Rail used to use atrazine and simazine extensively for weed control on their rail tracks. Is that still permitted?
No, it's not anymore permitted, although it, as a triazine herbicide, it doesn't break down very quickly, and so it still turns up in surface water and groundwater analyses. So it's still in the supply, but at low concentrations, and can be treated more readily than metaldehyde. But yeah, we do have a number of pesticides. We have this historical legacy, but many are banned, and that concerns the farmers because they need a range of pesticides in their so-called toolkit. So they just use one, the bugs become hardened to it. So they fear that the continual removal of products from the market will make it harder for them to control pests. So they try and push back a bit on the EU's drive to reduce some of these toxic chemicals in the environment. So it is a bit political. Okay, one last one.
Just to pick up on the correlate to that, which is the overuse of antibiotics in farming,
yes,
which has then produced resistances in human, that then impacts severely on human population.
Yeah.
Presumably, as you apply pesticides and you get resistant species then in the biosphere, then we get all sorts of other connotations. And looking at this Europe-wide, then any pesticides which are freely entering into ecosystems through the drinking water system would implicitly have some negative implications, I assume.
So the technocrats stick to this 0.1 part per billion for these sort of worries that we don't entirely understand without further research. Is that enough questions?
I think so, yeah. Andy and Kevin have touched on this already, but I just wanted to sort of really re-emphasise the work that we're doing in the university, working with other partners, farmers, water companies and others. And I think this has been mentioned, but obviously our region is really a crop region. That's probably our biggest industry. And water is vital for that. And so we've just been working over the past sort of year and a half together, doing various workshops and activities with farmers. So I'm just going to talk you through this. There's nothing majorly complicated in this, but I just wanted to emphasise that it's been fun and it's been really useful, I think. So Kevin didn't really talk too much in detail about this, but again, this is going back up to where he's got this very detailed monitoring on the River Wensum. And this was last year, I think we took a mixed group. So we invited lots of farmers from other parts of Norfolk and Suffolk to come and meet the farm manager from the farm. And Kevin talked about the work that they're doing. But also the farmers could then really see for themselves what this other farm had been doing and actually look at the crops and the way they're growing it and everything, how it was all managed. And just see for themselves where there are opportunities to work with researchers and to work on in a sort of more water-friendly way. Again, a lot of this made a lot more sense to the farmers. They're saying, oh, look at the tram lines. And I was like, oh, yes. I think that meant that he planted it very straight and he didn't have any weeds in his field. But this was a field where they trialled cover crops as a way to prevent, in the winter, to prevent soil runoff. This is obviously in the summer. It's a lovely day. And this is a biobed, which again I think is an amazing thing. That this is where they can wash down their tractors and their machinery once they've been out on the field. And also the sort of kit that they use to apply the pesticides, which is very concentrated. And instead of just like washing that off and letting all that go into the river, they can run it through this, a bit hard to see, but it's just basically a pit of soil where the wastewater with all the concentrated chemicals will run through over several months, is it? It would go through, and then naturally, so bacteria and other microorganisms will break down the chemicals, and at the bottom of it, they can drain out, and it's broken down by thousandfolds, I think. So it's almost clean water, and that can go back out into the river. And so obviously, if you want to know about the details of that, ask Kevin. But I just wanted to illustrate that it was a great way to bring different types of people together and to see for ourselves how these things can work. And Andy's mentioned already the Water Resources East Anglia project. And again, this was a workshop that we held, again, a workshop with people from Anglian Water, ourselves at the university, and lots of farmers that we'd invited. This is Steve Moncaster, who's head of Water Resources for East Anglia. So he's the person who has to actually work out how much water is going to be needed with, Andy mentioned there's more people use more water in their homes, but abstraction will be reduced, climate change will be probably less rain. How can you fit all that and make sure that you've got water for agriculture, because it's very vital for our region here. And abstraction reforms will also affect the farmers, so they'll be likely to have less access to water for irrigation. So it sounds like an intractable problem, but perhaps, as Andy's mentioned already, that perhaps by working together, it's possible to share resources or possibly share reservoirs. And the farmers are starting to think about this. Another interesting thing I found is that that slide that Kevin showed that average of rainfall, hotter, drier, wetter, warmer. We showed that slide at our first farmer workshop, and there was a lot of mumbling as I was in the audience. I don't believe that. And the version we showed had the actual month and the year, so farmers could remember, because obviously they'll remember April 2012 was very dry, and then it rained, and they're, no. We're like, that's not modelling, it's not anything to do with climate change, that's actual measured weather that we've experienced. And so some farmers are preparing for that, and the film I want to show at the end will meet one of the farmers from near the Felixstowe Peninsula at the River Deben. And they're really thinking about how they can best use their water, because they want to increase irrigation and that increase profitability for them. And some farmers have put on reservoirs on their own land, and they can spend millions on these. So these are big investments. And other farmers are like, I don't believe it because it's raining. So we've got a bit of we've got a varied farming community here that have got some different approaches, but people are definitely interested to know what might happen and where they could work together. So if you want to know more about this, I've got our cards outside, so I've got my email there, and that's our website address. So I just want to skip to another partnership project. So that was East Anglia, and I'm going to go to the national level. So I mentioned I'm involved with the UK Water Partnership. And this is a national partnership programme that involves funders, so science research funders, involves the water companies, it involves DEFRA, other governmental agencies. And last year, I wasn't actually involved in these reports, but last year they commissioned these 3 reports looking at the 3 ways really where water and food connect. So that is on agriculture and water quality, agriculture and water availability, water resources, and water in food. And I've got copies outside. Some people have already picked them up, but please take them. I don't want to take them home. So if you're interested, that's quite detailed analysis of how these things work together.
I think they've all gone.
They've all gone? Superb. Yes, you're welcome to they're online as well, so I can either email them or send you paper copies. So literally Monday, this week I was in Cardiff where it was raining, torrential rain, and we met the Water and Agriculture group, and we were just discussing those three areas are fairly obvious, and there's a lot of work going on. We don't want to replicate work that's going on, but we were just discussing amongst those sort of partners, what could we take forward in the next sort of year and a half. Now, obviously, this issue about food and water is not going to go away, because there's a huge amount of water that comes into the country in our food. And obviously, to try to address that, there's obviously a lot we can do as consumers, but we need to really understand what the supermarkets are doing there, and they've got a huge amount of buying power, they've got direct access to their producers. The other thing that we really wanted to do, I've talked to you about some fairly small scale, to be honest, examples of farmers and partnership working. And up till now, it's tended to be that people who work on floods are one group of people, researchers, one part of DEFRA, one part of the Environment Agency. Don't necessarily talk to people who are dealing with irrigation and water resources, etc. So what we'd really like to do, and DEFRA are quite interested in this, is to take an area, perhaps Cumbria, and to try to look at how you would work on a whole sort of catchment, but also regional scale, and get communities, the agencies, the farmers, the water companies, etc., town planners, building, everything all together in one. Because a lot of this has been discussed, but I don't think yet anyone's really tried to address that all in one go. Another issue that came up, and Andy's mentioned this a little bit, is about the potential for trading. Andy talked about it for water, but nutrients is another area that could benefit perhaps from a more national trading scheme. I joke, but I think it's quite a great idea. So there's lots and lots of spare nutrients from the West Country, all of that slurry, and we need to, in this country, the farmers buy chemical, expensive chemical. So I reckon if you stick all that slurry in the Thames, you could transport it down to East Anglia, extract it out, and then you could just supply it onto the fields. And that's not really what, of course, that they're doing, but you know, the potential for making best use of those resources and potentially opening up new markets and creating new economic opportunities for businesses that would run those sort of trading schemes. And of course, we mentioned the point that investments in infrastructure is expensive. Some farmers can afford to do that themselves, but as water customers ourselves, we want to see that done in the best way that can benefit as many different people as possible. So that is literally hot off the press. We're thinking about what we could do here. And I think, that's it. Unless, anyone want to ask any quick questions on that? Go ahead.
Farm you showed where they were washing down their pesticides. That wasn't Saul, was it?
That's Saul Farm, yes.
I thought it might.
Yes, that's right, yeah. So this film is just 5 minutes, so I'll literally show that and I'll be around over lunch for the rest of the day. And the film just shows those three issues. One about farmers and water resources, trying to make best use of water for irrigation. Then the supermarket example. And then just to make sure we don't all just cover England, we went up to Scotland and talked to Scottish Water about their work.
I'm Bruce Kerr, I'm a farmer here in East Suffolk and I'm a member of the East Suffolk Water Abstractors Group. What we're proposing on the Felixstowe Peninsula is being able to use the water that the Internal Drainage Board are pumping out to sea at the moment, and with the help of the partner organisations, so the Internal Drainage Boards, the Environment Agency, and local farmers and landowners, led by the County Council, turn that water round and use it back inland by pumping it back inland onto the sandy soils where the water is really needed in the summertime for vegetable and potato production. The fact that we're growing currently crops that are marginal at best in economic performance, and we can improve that economic performance by growing more potatoes, more carrots, more onions, and a wider range of crops on these soils. By putting more water into the local economy, then we're looking at more jobs and more sustainability for those units involved.
My name is Amy Grove. I am a Catchment Liaison Officer in the Sustainable Land Management team at Scottish Water. Land use such as farming activities and forestry can have an impact on drinking water quality, and it will mean that we'll need to increase the energy usage and chemicals that we use at water treatment. And the general consensus is that the cleaner the water is going into the water treatment works, the easier it is to treat. Scottish Water's Sustainable Land Management team is all about working collaboratively with land managers, farmers and developers. We mainly do this through our Sustainable Land Management Incentive Scheme, which is all about advising and offering financial assistance to farmers and land managers to protect drinking water sources. So here at Winterhope Reservoir in lowland Scotland, we mainly have sheep and cattle grazing, and we'd be really looking for livestock fencing and water troughs. Also to not spray any pesticides during or after heavy rainfall. And if we continue with the scheme and we're able to implement these measures, then we'll be able to supply our constant, clean, fresh, wholesome drinking water that the people of Scotland experience every day.
I travel around the world and we source things from over 70 countries around the world, and we buy a lot of these green beans from Kenya. My name's Judith Batchelor, I'm Director of Sainsbury's brand. The challenge for us in managing water in our supply chains, both here in the UK and abroad, is understanding where we're using water and the impact that our practices have on water usage. A good example of that is the work that we do around Lake Naivasha in Kenya, where under our more crop per drop programme, we've managed to reduce the amount of water that we're using to grow things like green beans and roses by between 15 and 25%. And using technology, we think we can reduce that even further. There is only one way to approach something as complex as water, and that's by working collaboratively. The fact is, there is no other way of dealing with this problem than working collaboratively. Nothing else will work.
We need to be looking at joined up answers. We know we're going to have to produce more food for a bigger population, and we need to find a way of doing that.
Nice video. Are you finished? No, I'm finished. Oh, well, thank you very much. Well, I think we have to agree that water is no longer the silent service, as Andy first introduced. And I think by the end of this morning, you've got the idea that we need to work collaboratively. And I think your presentation really made that point very clear. So all of us in this room are involved in these issues. I'm glad that you're here today to take part in the debate. So that's all for this morning. We'll have an hour's rest now and some lunch, and then we'll return to hear a different perspective from Ben Orchard here on the business of brewing beer. So for now, enjoy your lunch and see you back at 1:20. Thank you.